My breakthrough came while I was clearing out the attic, looking for a box of old prints. Tucked away behind a stack of moth-eaten blankets was a small, dusty envelope addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. My pulse spiked as I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It was a note, dated only 3 days before she left, written with a frantic, shaky hand. Ayanna, if you are reading this, the house has become a cage. Julian isn't who he says he is, and he has found a way to use your father's past against him. Please, don't let him convince you that you are alone. I thought my mother leaving broke our family forever. But after she was gone, I saw my father sneaking out every night. I followed him once, and what I found changed my life. My name is Ayanna Morningstar. I am a wildlife photographer, used to waiting hours in the brush for a glimpse of something rare, but nothing prepared me for the predator in my own living room. I always trusted my family, until my own cousin gave me the deepest betrayal of my life. The house always felt colder after my mother packed her bags and left us in the dead of winter. Dad never spoke about it, retreating into a shell of silence that grew thicker every year. I was 31, old enough to know that people drift, but the atmosphere in our home shifted from sad to suspicious when I began hearing the creak of the floorboards at midnight. I would lie in bed, my camera gear scattered across the room, listening to the soft, rhythmic click of the back door latch. It wasn't a casual stroll, it was deliberate, hushed, and frantic. I told myself it was grief, that maybe he was visiting her grave or finding some solitary comfort under the stars, but the frequency grew until it was every single night. I felt a cold prickle of dread, a sensation similar to being stalked by something you cannot see. I kept watching in silence, peering through the slats of my bedroom blinds, watching his silhouette vanish into the dense trees bordering our property. Why would a man who could barely muster the energy to make coffee choose to wander the woods in the biting dark? I wondered if he was hiding his pain, drinking himself into a stupor somewhere, or perhaps something much worse. The uncertainty was a weight, pressing against my ribs until I couldn't breathe. I knew I couldn't play the part of the oblivious daughter anymore. The questions gnawed at my composure until I finally made the decision to stop watching from the shadows and become the observer I was trained to be. The following night, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. I dressed in dark, non-reflective layers, my camera bag slung tightly over my shoulder like a shield. When the familiar soft clicks sounded downstairs, I waited 3 minutes before sliding out the kitchen window. I followed him at a distance, using the dense cover of the pines to mask my movement. He wasn't heading to the cemetery or the main road. Instead, he led me toward the old guest cabin, a structure my cousin Julian had been renovating for the past 2 years. I saw him reach the porch and stop. The cabin door opened, spilling a sliver of yellow light onto the porch, and there stood Julian. I ducked behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak, my breath hitching in my throat. I never expected to see them together like this, whispering, tense, the air between them thick with a bizarre, conspiratorial energy. Dad looked broken, his shoulders hunched, while Julian leaned in close, his hands animated, gesturing as if he were holding the strings to a marionette. I crouched lower, pressing my back against the rough bark, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't just a late-night visit, it was an interrogation. I realized my family knew far more than I ever suspected, and the secrecy wasn't about protecting Dad, it was about controlling him. The next morning, the house felt like a tomb. Julian arrived for breakfast, his smile as bright and effortless as a sunny day in June. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements casual, almost mocking. I watched him, searching for the shadow of the man I'd seen in the dark. I started by asking simple questions, playing the part of the concerned cousin who just wanted to understand why Dad looked so exhausted lately. I asked about the cabin, about the noise I thought I heard, and about why Dad had been staying up so late. Julian didn't blink. He gave me every calm, practiced answer, telling me that Dad was just helping him with the plumbing, that old pipes were noisy, and that the stress of the house was just getting to him. At first, I wanted to believe him. I wanted the simplicity of his lies to be the truth. but I had spent years capturing the nuance of animal behavior, learning to spot the microtells that a creature was about to bolt. I noticed the way his left eye twitched just a fraction when I mentioned the woods, and how he repeated my questions back to me, a classic tactic to buy time. His words were smooth, but the rhythm was off. I began to catch the small, jagged inconsistencies in his story. He claimed they were working on the bathroom, yet I had seen no tools, no supplies, and no lights in the room they entered. I began to suspect that my cousin wasn't just helping, he was orchestrating something meant to keep me in the dark. I read the words over and over until the ink seemed to blur into my vision. I understood now. She hadn't abandoned us because she stopped loving us. She had tried to warn me, and likely, she had been pushed out by the very person I was currently sharing a breakfast table with. The realization made my skin crawl. She had known the poison was already in the well, and she had sacrificed her place in our lives to keep me safe from the fallout. I sat on the hard wooden floor, the dust motes dancing in the light, and made a silent vow. I would not stop until I unraveled every thread of the web Julian had spun around my father. The more I looked, the more the mask slipped. I started paying attention to the way Julian spoke to my father when he thought I wasn't listening. He used specific phrases, guilt-tripping, reminders of past failures, threats about family property. I saw how my father's posture would sag, how he would agree to things he didn't want to do, all because Julian held a secret, a financial indiscretion from years ago, over his head like a guillotine. It was manipulation of the worst kind, preying on an aging, grieving man's fear of shame. I finally understood why Dad acted so strangely. He was a hostage in his own home. Every late-night work session was actually a forced consultation where Julian drained his bank account and his spirit. The betrayal was far deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about money. It was about erasing my mother's legacy, piece by piece, and replacing her memory with a narrative that made Julian the savior of our family. My blood boiled, but I knew that reacting in anger would only give him more leverage. The truth about why my mother left was a jagged piece of glass in my heart. She hadn't just left. She had been forced to leave to protect me from Julian's threats to implicate me in his schemes if she stayed and fought. The weight of that sacrifice was almost too heavy to carry. I felt heartbroken, shattered by the knowledge that I had been blind to her protection for so long. I went to my darkroom, the red light casting a sickly glow over my photos, and almost gave up. The temptation to just walk away, to sell the house and move to a different state, was intoxicating. But then I looked at the photos of the wolves I had taken in the wild, creatures that fought for their pack against impossible odds. I reminded myself that truth, no matter how painful, is the only thing that can truly set a foundation for freedom. I stopped pretending that everything was normal. When I spoke to Julian now, I didn't let him see the fire in my eyes. Instead, I acted the part of the compliant, slightly clueless cousin. I started testing him, asking questions that seemed innocent but were designed to trap him. I asked about the bank transfers he told Dad to make, pretending I had accidentally seen a statement. I watched his face tighten, the way he would stutter when he had to invent a new lie on the spot. Each time he tried to backtrack, his story shifted. He claimed he was investing for us, then claimed it was for property taxes, then back to maintenance. I recorded it all, keeping a mental log of every contradiction. I saw the new mistakes pile up, the cracks in his narrative becoming wide enough to drive a truck through. I wasn't just waiting for him to trip, I was nudging him toward the ledge. I prepared myself for the confrontation, knowing that once I pulled the trigger, there was no going back to the comfortable, albeit fake, peace we had lived in for years. I began my collection of evidence with the precision of a crime scene investigator. I took photos of the secret meetings from the Treeline, screen-captured the digital logs I found on the home computer, and gathered the copies of the falsified financial documents I unearthed from his desk in the cabin. I knew I needed an ally, someone who wouldn't be swayed by Julian's charismatic lies. I went to Mr. Henderson, a retired lawyer and our family's oldest friend. He sat in his study, listening to me with a growing frown, his eyes hardening as I laid the documents on his desk. "You have enough here to destroy him," he whispered. We organized every piece of evidence into chronological order, creating a clear, undeniable picture of the exploitation. I didn't want a shouting match. I wanted a trial. I created a plan to expose him during our annual family barbecue, when everyone, my aunts, uncles, and the rest of our extended circle, would be present. It was the stage he had used for years to build his image of the perfect, devoted cousin, and it would be the exact place where I would dismantle it. The day of the barbecue was stiflingly hot. Julian was in his element, grilling, laughing, and playing the role of the devoted son to my father, who sat in the corner looking haunted. When the food was served, I stood up. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't scream. I spoke with a voice that was eerily calm, cutting through the chatter like a knife. "I have something to show everyone," I said, projecting my voice across the patio. I handed out copies of the bank statements and the messages I had retrieved. One by one, I presented the proof. I showed the records of the money drained from Dad's accounts, the messages where Julian threatened to ruin Dad's reputation if he didn't comply, and the timeline of how he had systematically pushed my mother out of the house. Julian stood frozen, his face losing its color, his smile twitching before disappearing into a snarl of denial. "This is a setup, she's crazy," he shouted, but the evidence spoke for itself. My father, finally pushed past his breaking point, stood up. His voice cracked as he turned to Julian and asked the questions he had been afraid to ask for years. "Why did you make me fear my own daughter? Why did you make me choose between my family and your greed?" The fallout was swift and absolute. Julian tried to maintain the lie, but the presence of Mr. Henderson, who stepped forward with the official legal backing of the evidence, silenced the room. Julian's face fell, not in regret, but in the realization that his influence was gone. He was forced to leave the property under the watchful eyes of the guests who had once admired him. In the following weeks, the legal consequences caught up to him. When the authorities audited the accounts he had controlled, they found years of fraud and embezzlement. He lost the cabin, his reputation in the town was shredded, and he was served with a massive civil lawsuit that effectively stripped him of his financial standing and any chance of returning to the family circle. My father, now freed from the shadow of the man who had held him captive, finally broke down. We sat on the porch, the same porch where the secrets had been born, and he apologized for his weakness, for letting fear dictate our lives. I held his hand, the silence between us no longer heavy with secrets, but filled with a shared, painful understanding. We made the final cut, officially severing all contact with Julian and everyone associated with his lies. It was a difficult, ugly process, but it was necessary to prune the dead branches so something healthy could grow in their place. I realized then that my worth was not tied to what I could do for my family, but to who I was when I was alone and honest. I began to rebuild my life, not based on the legacy of what had been broken, but on the strength I found when I finally spoke up. I started taking new commissions, traveling to photograph